Semiconductors are in almost every piece of electronic technology you interact with on a daily basis. From smartphones to microwaves to coffee makers and certainly in freight vehicles, you see them used every day. Yet in the last few years, we've seen a dramatic drop in semiconductors, which has slowed production of many other things, if not stopped it completely. So how do we get to this space? Well, it starts with the nature of the semiconductor industry in that not all chips are the same. You have the high technologically advanced chips, which are in the latest smartphones and computers. Then you have chips that are built to do complex but more simple tasks, which are the ones found in trucks and automobiles. We talked to two semiconductor experts at top universities, Dr. John Fowler at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and Dr. Willy Shih of the Harvard University Business School in Boston, Massachusetts. We asked them how we got into this situation, and by no one's surprise, it starts with the pandemic.
So the demand for automobiles in particular went down considerably at that point. And we have taught companies, the supply chain professionals have actually taught companies to keep their inventories as low as possible, right? So try and have zero inventory. And so they cut orders for automobiles and therefore cut the orders for the chips for automobiles.
Now, meanwhile, what we had was a big shift in demand. So there was a lot more demand for household goods, hard goods, appliances, exercise machines, TV sets, and things like that, which, by the way, drew on that same kind of semiconductor capacity.
Add to that several non-economic factors.
You had the big polar vortex in Texas.
A fire at the AKM factory in Japan.
There was also Malaysia had shutdowns because of the flu.
And you've created an environment where semiconductor production can fall flat.
During the 2008-2009 downturn, I happened to be walking through one of these multi-billion-dollar semiconductor fabs in Taiwan. And, while they didn't disclose it, just by looking at it, I would say they were operating at under 20% utilization. Okay, and when you run a big factory like that, at that kind of low utilization, you are losing money hand over fist.
And that leads to stories like this one.
What are they stealing and why?
Okay, so what they're stealing is essentially called a powertrain control module. This is essentially what is the computer brains of the truck. Inside that powertrain control module are semiconductors, microchips, things like that. Daimler won't say how many, but essentially what they're doing is they're harvesting or taking apart these modules. They're taking those semiconductors, reprogramming them, and then using them in other trucks, in other VIN numbers.
Which brings us back to the idea of why there wasn't more resilience built into the market and easing this pressure that automobile and truck makers are feeling when it comes to semiconductor needs.
Again, supply chain professionals have been taught that you want to keep inventories low. So the focus has been on reducing costs by keeping inventories low. I think there's a renewed emphasis on resilience. So how much do we keep? Maybe that's a higher level than we've kept in the past.
The question goes back to how much more are you willing to pay for resiliency? Okay, and everybody talks about it now, but when it gets down to a choice between will I buy part A, which has a less resilient supply chain but costs half as much as part B, where I have multiple sources or somebody's carrying more inventory, a lot of people pick the less expensive route. And that's the core of the problem.
But getting back to normal is not as easy as flipping the lights back on inside a factory.
What people don't realize is when a semiconductor plant goes down, it doesn't go down for the number of days that it's physically turned off, that the electricity is off. It takes a long time to bring things back. And many of the products that were, when you lost power, are really destroyed, and you've almost got to start over on some of those products.
This begs the question, if it's so tough to get facilities to get back online, make the chips, and then send them overseas to America, why doesn't some billionaire decide to create a semiconductor plant in the United States?
If you just want to come in and say, I want to compete with somebody like TSMC or Samsung or Intel, I think that's a multi-decade long march that you have to go on to get into that business. If you want to build commodity semiconductors, you can buy companies that want to do that, or you can expand that capacity. But you have to be very careful about how you're going to make money there, because it's an expensive business and you've got to run at high utilization.
So with no real near-term solution, we're left looking for the end of the tunnel in terms of when we might see a return to normalcy for these needed chips. When might that end come?
Yeah, I think it's going to be at least late 23, maybe 24. I guess Pat Gelsinger, the Intel CEO, recently said he thinks it's going to be that we're only about halfway through the shortage at this point, and so that it's likely to be into 24 before we really climb out of that.
What we're seeing now is the middle of this shortage, as demand is beginning to be met in some areas and hopefully in the transportation industry in the not so distant future. However, Dr. Shih says don't be surprised if you see the opposite happen in a few years.
The worst thing that can happen to a lot of these semiconductor makers is to put on a lot of capacity and then in a couple of years have excess capacity and a price collapse. They all worry about it. I think it's probably coming.